Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing Kinds of Kindness. Directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, Kinds of Kindness is a triptych fable that consists of three distinct but loosely connected stories. The film stars Emma Stone, Jesse Plemons, Willem Dafoe, and Margaret Qualley. So Jeffrey, what did you think about Kinds of Kindness?
Yorgos Lanthimos is a really interesting director to me, mostly because of the trajectory of his career up until this point. He started out as a very idiosyncratic filmmaker, oddly transgressive, very cynical. His films felt like flatly delivered, almost in the way that Wes Anderson films are, but deliberately devoid of emotion, almost in a way that disarmed his audience and to the disturbing subject matter that he really liked to explore in his films. But for as scorched earth pessimism as he liked to explore in his films, they were often like hilariously funny, if you could stomach them. This was true of his career from Dogtooth, where I first encountered him, all the way up until The Favorite. Now, The Favorite and Poor Things saw him taking this odd sensibility and kind of sculpting it more for a mainstream audience, making it somewhere more acceptable while melding some of those odd sensibilities that he really likes to explore. I like both those films a lot, and objectively, I think that they're quite good and very well made, very successful. But some, including myself, saw it as a watering down of his more transgressive and more controversial subject matter that he liked to explore earlier in his career. That brings us to Kinds of Kindness, which propels us back into that register of controversy, I think, once again. In many ways, this is a throwback to his earlier films in how unabashedly weird, alienating, deliberately off-putting it is. Not only is this film filled with disturbing subject matter, things as far as cutting out organs or sexual assault or domestic abuse, or if you want to name the thing, it's probably in this movie. But it almost seems actively hostile towards its audience at times. We're given a distinct lack of context within these stories. Characters are often emblematic more of ideas rather than they are fully fleshed out characters or human beings. And perhaps most frustrating of all to a mainstream audience, a complete lack of resolution in most cases, something that he became known for in Dogtooth and that has continued throughout his career. What I just described sounds like a negative review in a lot of ways, but I really like this film. I don't think it's without flaw, that's definitely for sure, but I was charmed by being back in this very eccentric, very bleak, very funny, painfully funny register that Yorgos hasn't worked in probably since like 2017 at this point with Killing of a Sacred Deer. I've been missing that quality in his films, and I find this film to be a bit of a success.
So you were talking about these three stories or fables, as you mentioned specifically, and while they are different in so many different ways, there also seems to be this unifying connective theme of what I'd like to coin unwavering devotion to insanity. What?
Yes. Yeah, we'll go deeper than that. I'm not sure it's a devotion to insanity. I think it's insanity by way of devotion.
Yes. That's sort of what I mean. Anyways, the film focuses on these individuals who have extremely fringe belief systems that really lend itself well to the overall absurdity present throughout the film. Characters throughout each story often act in ways unusual to the human experience, but also in ways very usual to the human experience. I think a lot of the narratives playing through these stories do exist in the real world, like people being obsessed with cults.
Trying to impress your boss.
Yes.
And accelerate through a corporate structure.
I was literally just about to say that.
Okay, my apologies.
So basically, I'm going to go through each of the three stories now, because the first one is really an obsession with a powerful figure. And the character that Jesse Plemons plays in this role is somebody who has really no purpose unless it's pleasing this person. And in the second, it's obsession with tragedy in someone that you love has come back from a terrible experience and is not the same person that they were before. And the last one is the obsession of a cult, seeking one who has powers to bring the dead back to life. In each case, our characters can't really seem to deal with reality and rely on power or absurd ideas to find purpose and meaning in life.
Something I noticed in this film, and this is true of Dogtooth and it's true of The Lobster and even Killing of a Sacred Deer to some degree, characters are trying to navigate a world that increasingly doesn't make sense to them. And in doing so, create these elaborate rules for themselves that satirize the way that we live as human beings. It's taking a theme and it's reducing it to the absurd. So for instance, if the first story shows someone so desperate to please their boss to get ahead at work, they'll let that person control every aspect of their life, whether that's they'll sacrifice having a family, they'll put themselves in harm's way in order to,
the resolution that the boss wants. Which
they'll put themselves in harm's way to have a strange car accident.
Yeah.
It's absurd, but it's there to highlight the absurdity of the compulsion of that at all within the labor sector. This third story shows a cult so desperate to make sense of the world and find spiritual awakening that there's this equal obsession with purity. They can only drink water with tears of their founders. They can't eat fish. They can't have sexual relations with people from the outside because it will force their bodies to be contaminated. That story in particular is this great satire of purity culture. Anything from wellness to sexual purity that we're experiencing in our daily lives. With all those absurd scenarios and the absurdity highlighting these desperations, these people are searching for meaning and just simply not finding it. In The Lobster, we saw the absurdity of compatibility. People thought, oh, if my partner is blind, then I have to be blind in order to match them. That's what compatibility is all about. But I see this as a unifying theme of characters looking for patterns and rules in a world and a society that's so confusing, so desperately lacking in meaning that they have to concoct it themselves. Yorgos' film is very, very funny, but the root of the humor is in the futility of these pursuits to actually produce a meaningful life and a meaningful output. This is a huge spoiler for the film, so gigantic spoiler warning.
Oh, we're going to spoilers already.
Spoilers. So at the end of the film, this is the end of the third story. Emma Stone finds who she thinks is the Messiah, so to speak, who will bring people back from the dead. She drives too fast, she drives too recklessly, and while searching for the pure water that only she can drink and only the people of her cult can drink, crashes and kills the Messiah. Can you imagine relentlessly, desperately putting your spiritual well-being into this one singular idea, this one person, and your own short-sightedness deprives yourself and your fellow cult members of that salvation? That's really funny.
It is.
I mean, it's really despairing, but it's really funny to add another layer to what you're talking about. I think that the film is very much about obsession. I think it's about looking for meaning and looking for patterns and rules within the world and trying to concoct some sort of meaning out of it. But at the same time, being so obsessed with that pursuit that you're too short-sighted to see how your life can actually meaningfully change.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. With regard to these thematic elements that you were just describing, I would argue I found them a little bit more interesting on paper than how the film presented them. I often felt a lack of depth or commitment to each story. I was wanting and waiting for each to really lean into the absurdity, and the only times it really did that in these really hilarious moments were these credit sequences at the end of each individual story. There was little visuals playing behind the credits, and I thought those to be some of the funniest aspects of the movie.
Oh, like the dogs driving?
Yeah.
I will say, I welcome Yorgos back to this type of filmmaking. I think it is a less sharp and less effectual film than he's made. Probably the least effectual film he's made since Alps in 2012. I think the second story is probably the weakest of the three. I don't know if you agree with that, but I think it's a bit too obvious in its metaphors. But I think the first story is basically a knockout, and the third story is really, really good. But individual moments of the third, her finding the dog, or the very, very end of the film, I thought were just brilliant. I agree with you, though. I think this is minor Lanthimos, but it's still Lanthimos. Like, I don't really know anyone else that works in this register, works in this particular melding of misanthropy and absurdity and just this great observation of satirical outlook that he has on life.
Okay, so there's a few things I want to touch on. I'm going to touch on briefly the dark humor in the film because you were talking about that one moment with the dog, and I want to elaborate on that because it's a really hilarious moment of the film.
I think this movie is really, really funny, and our audience was not laughing. And we did see it in like the town I grew up in. It was like very square. I'm sure if we saw this in New York, people would be laughing, but I think this movie is really funny.
So there's this moment with a dog. Emma Stone's character finds this dog and she basically abuses it to bring it into the vet to find out if this person will heal the dog with their special powers.
Yep.
She has to come up with concoct this elaborate story as of how the dog got hurt, her dog. She doesn't mention that she found it on the street. She pretends and plays it off that it's her dog. Funny moment right at the beginning, the vet asks how old the dog is, and she says 5, and the vet's like, oh, the dog looks older than that, and then she switches it just to 6. Like, it's this big difference, like 1 year.
Yeah, she also mixes up the name later, too. She's like, oh, my husband calls her that, but I call her this.
Yeah, and there's a particular moment in that scene, too, where she's talking about the thing that weighs the dog, and that comes back to play a little bit later, which I love that little detail.
The way she gets rid of the dog, too, is she just unleashes it and says, go, which... The humor of that is all in the edit, which, by the way, I find treating animals really haphazardly and cruelly not that funny, except that this
film, it worked. It did it well.
It worked.
Yeah.
Like, I very rarely feel that way, but I thought it really worked in this film.
Going back to what you were talking about earlier, because I do want to tap into this, you were talking about how the characters are more in service of thematics than they are in character development. That was one of the issues I had with the film, because I thought a lot of these stories could have held a little bit more weight if we built a little bit more character development. And to elaborate that, I just really wanted Yorgos to go down this rabbit hole of this absurdity and quiet tension. And I guess you don't necessarily need the character development to make this work, but I feel like it could have helped in these instances. For example, the first story I personally thought was a little bit predictable. Before Plemons' character goes to the other house and finds and takes back the tennis racket, I figured out he was going to do this immediately when he figured out Emma Stone was his quote-unquote replacement. That story in particular, as well as some of the other ones, including the second one, were just a little half-baked. I really want to see more in terms of the building of tension and payoff at the end, because there's some great endings to each story. Going into the second one, I thought the story had a very little building of tension, and I felt like there was so much opportunity for tension. There's these great dinner sequences with their friends. One is a coworker on the police force with Jesse Plemons' character. This is when things start to get a little crazy with Jesse Plemons' character. He's starting to lose his mind. He doesn't think his wife is actually his wife. He thinks she's been replaced by maybe an alien or something. And it's really
but she may not be his wife.
But she may not be his wife. I don't know. But he's really succumbed to this idea that this person is not my wife. I think this dinner sequence goes by with too little fanfare. And I thought there could have been some great tension in there.
I think the second story in general is pretty unsuccessful.
Oh, you missed by the way, when you walked out of the theater to use the bathroom quickly, you missed the first dinner sequence, which was actually pretty good.
He's having dinner with the two people without her.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. But you didn't see what he wanted to do. Like, he kept asking at the end of the dinner, can we go watch that video I wanted to watch? And they were both refusing. And so it turns out to be a sex tape with all four of them. So they're sitting awkwardly on the couch watching this sex tape back.
Oh, that would have been really fun.
Yes, and that's the moment you missed. But by the end of that story, I really get the point that Jesse Plemons' heartbreak is creating all this delusion, but I feel like it really lacked any weight or attachment to it. I thought it was a really good ending. It's a really good ending of him not knowing who his wife is, so he puts her through all this stuff, and I think the end is an illusion. When she is lost on this deserted island, he's wanting the person that he knew to come back exactly how she was, but the reality is that she went through a lot of traumatic experiences there, and she's never going to come back.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a variety of things. I think everything you're saying is really insightful, and certainly within the text, something you could
it's an interpretation.
Easily extrapolate from the text. In one way, I really like when a new story starts, because all of these stories thrive on disorientation. Like, you're kind of thrust into the midst of a new story, left to fend for yourself with all of these little oddities that become apparent throughout the story. And piece by piece, the plot of it starts to come together.
Yeah.
I like that tactic a lot. It's more fun as a viewer, I think, to be confused and slowly piece together the context of what you're looking at, rather than being told, here's the reasons and here's the exposition, etc. The confusion and distinct lack of context also makes us view these stories more so as parables, like short allegories of casual misanthropy and cynicism and the humor and cruelty. I found that very involving as a viewer, so I was able to forgive some of the things that you're talking about simply because I was searching for those clues to orient myself.
So on that note of the parables you were discussing, I want to discuss how they're built with our characters here, because I found that to be very interesting. With that said, I'm going to use Jesse Plemons' character as an example of this, and then I'm going to bring it back to Emma Stone's character afterwards. Jesse Plemons' character in the first plays this really insecure, needy person who is constantly looking to his boss, as we described. In the second film, he becomes an individual who becomes more deluded, but also more disturbed with certainty. And in the last story, he is a very certain, very dedicated individual that by all accounts seems as sane as any typical individual, which almost makes him more disturbing. Even though they're different characters throughout each story, there's an overall arc of his changing behavioral patterns in his delusions. It goes from insecurity to more certainty and like blind faith to his beliefs.
Like a dogma.
So Emma Stone now follows the same exact trajectory, but in the opposite direction.
That's interesting.
As we noticed, Jesse Plemons is more prominent in the first story. Then it's sort of like they're both prominent in the second one. They both have about 50-50 of the story there. And the last one is more Emma Stone forward. Remember, she has no hesitation to do what the boss needs.
Yep.
There's no qualms about it. The second one, you see a little bit of that insecurity seeping in. And the third one, she becomes a very insecure, very needy person who needs to feel worth by the cult leaders. It's just an interesting way that their stories both converge and go opposite each other.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Thanks. You're like, I have nothing to add to that.
So I think the look of the film is very textbook Yorgos Lanthimos. I find them like very alien and awkward, like they're often really wide, almost like you're viewing this alien society. It further highlights the idea of these cold, sterile worlds that the characters inhabit.
It did feel very sterile and a little bit lifeless to me. And that's the point. I know, I understand that.
You haven't seen Killings of a Sacred Deer and you haven't seen Dogtooth. I think that you would see that this is a thing he does.
Yeah.
More so in those registers than maybe some of the films you've seen by him. I can't remember exactly the way the lobster looked. I remember it being a bit more plain in these films. I really like the score too. It's a rather simple score, but just uncomfortable piano. The song at the end is also produced by the person that made the score. I actually thought it was a Leonard Cohen song. I thought that was really good too.
And also, just the way that these three parables or stories work in favor of the actors here, I think is really cool. Jesse Plemons and Emma Stone and Willem Dafoe, they're really given this opportunity to let their acting abilities just fly in so many directions. All these emotional ranges that they're able to go through just because these stories allow them to. So it's just really cool to see them do that.
Yeah, and Jesse Plemons won Best Actor at the Cannes Film Festival for this film.
So you ready to go to grades?
Yeah, I'm going to give this film a B. I said before that I think it's minor Lanthimos. I stand by that. But at the same time, the particular register that this film works in, which is this despairing cynicism, almost like you're gasping for air in a society that doesn't make sense. It's just something I really identify with. It's a sense of humor that I don't get elsewhere. I think Yorgos has a knack and a real true sensibility to get to the heart of these issues and why they're so funny, why they're so desperate, why they're so absurd. I don't see a lot of filmmakers that really work in that type of absurdity. So that's why I appreciated this so much, because he hasn't really worked in this register for, as I said before, maybe 7 or 8 years. I thought it was a welcome return. It was not quite as successful as some of his earlier films, but if you look at the film he released 7 months ago, which is Poor Things, it's a film that has an utterly different sensibility than this film. So I really enjoyed that. I'm actually almost warming to the idea that The Favorite may be his best film in some ways, because it's a melding of a more mainstream sensibility with all of the oddities that he loves as a filmmaker. And then he gets a little bit more mainstream with Poor Things, and he goes way back in the other direction of being totally anti-mainstream and alien and off-putting with this film. But anyway, I think this was pretty successful, but not his best, so that's why I'm going with a B.
Yeah, so far of the Lanthimos films I've seen, it's probably my least favorite, unfortunately. While I appreciated a lot of aspects of the thematics and storytelling here, I feel like the film just felt a little bit half-baked and too predictable, coming from a filmmaker that typically really defies my expectations. With that said, I did like that each story was this little parable dealing with the obsession and commitment to ideas disconnected from reality. The characters' inabilities to think with reason due to various circumstances leads them down a path of getting lost in their delusions, thus ultimately leading to their downfall. I just wanted a little bit more grit here, something that was like a driving force for each of these stories. I thought it was a worthy watch, and one thing that you could always commend with Lanthimos films is that they are so unique and so creative. I give this film a C+. While I do give it that grade, I do appreciate what he's doing here.
Is this the worst movie of the year so far for you? I can't think of a film that you gave a lesser grade.
No, maybe. I guess so. Sorry.
Oh.
I apologize.
Very interesting.
All right, and that's it for our review of Kinds of Kindness. Kinds of Kindness is now in theaters, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.